Kerete. We are going to move into word studies today, and we're going to focus mainly because it's easier on a noun, kind of how to do a noun, but I'll throw in little things throughout on how you would do this with a verb as well, because there's a little bit more complexity there, only in the sense that you have to think about what tense or aspect is being related, and so that adds to your word study. But I'll throw that in as we go through. Does anybody have any questions before we get started on word studies? All right. And I think word studies are the biggest thing that you could probably take away from this class. Once you've learned the terminology and you start to see it more and more, then you start to look at how your interlinear is set up, then you'll be able to start interacting with these words. And though getting to a point where you could check the translation of the interlinear or translate for yourself is a wonderful thing. I'd love if everyone had that goal, but not everyone has that goal. But if you can at least get in where you can understand what is being said about a word and then develop it for yourself. So let's talk a little bit about this. Words have a range of meaning. That's sometimes referred to as the semantic range. It's interesting that semantic is the word that is used with this phrase semantic range, because semantic actually comes from French and goes all the way back to German, which is to assign or to signify. And so it's basically the idea of what does a word signify? And so what is the range of meanings that are possible for a specific word? And so, for instance, I think I used this illustration a couple months ago. What does the English word tank mean? Exactly. You've got a range of meaning, and they don't mean the same thing. And in fact, as we're going to see in just a moment, I think I already pointed it out, it's even a false overlap if you think that it's based on what a tank looks like, that it is connected to that kind of visual picture of the original word for tank. So if I'm reading a book, I can't just pick out the meaning that I like best. I go through, for instance, even in the Bible, I say, well, this is the word pistis, faith. So which definition of faith do I like best? Well, we can't do that. We have to make sure that we're keeping it in its context. Context is going to be everything here. And even here in English. Yes, Brother Tom?
In other words, we want to find out what the writer meant.
What the writer meant, exactly. And if we had this sentence on the screen, the contractor installed the tank in the utility closet, what meaning do you think the word tank has there in that context? What's that? Yes, you're probably not thinking a military vehicle. You're thinking about a hot water tank or something at least related to that could fit within a utility closet. So the context determines the meaning. And this is something we have to kind of change our minds on, I think, a little bit. This actually is our German heritage. A lot of German scholars back in the 1800s, with the way they began studying the Bible, Germans had this idea, and it's not completely wrong, but I think it leads us down some false paths, that if you can get down to the very most basic ideas of each individual signifier, is how they thought of it, then you're going to build out from there. And really what we find in actual language usage is that you don't take a look at every single word and then build it together. You build an idea from an entire phrase. And so really the basic level is the phrase, not just the word. But to understand the word, we have to keep it in its entire context, in its phrase. So instead of just saying the contractor, and then I look up everything about that, and then I form a completely mixed up sentence with every range of possible meaning, I take the whole phrase, and then I start to divide it up and figure out what the individual words mean in that phrase. So that's what I'm going to suggest from the very beginning is keep the phrase as the basic unit and then work down and work up instead of working from the very base level of word upward. That makes your life a whole lot more complex. You can usually narrow things down from the phrase alone before you get down to the word itself. So, but some words do have a wider range of wider semantic range than others. For instance, tank, we've already seen that it could mean an aquarium all the way to a military vehicle. But butterfly, that's a little bit more limited, isn't it? We don't have quite as wide a range. I think we at least have a couple of ideas from butterfly. For instance, if you see a butterfly outside, what do you think of? You already think about the bug, what you would commonly think of as a butterfly. But we could shift that just a little bit and say that I had butterfly shrimp at the restaurant. You're getting a picture of how it was prepared, which fits with the visual, but you're still at a limited range. We're not talking an aquarium versus a military vehicle. That's a wide range. That's a more limited range. So some words are more limited, some are broader. Any questions about that? All right, we have to determine the semantic range of a word and then its contextual meaning. So though I want phrase to be the base, we do also have to look down at the word and figure out what is its contextual meaning, because since this is a foreign language, we are automatically going to have to figure out what is the range of meaning, and then I'm going to determine from the context what best fits. For instance, the contractor installed the tank in the utility closet. Since I am already very familiar with that language, I already know what the possible range of meaning for each of those words is, and I automatically limit it in my mind. We do have to dig down a little bit when we're talking about a foreign language, because it's not our native language. We don't know the possible range of meaning. And if we don't want to be completely reliant on the translator's translation and interpretation, then we might have to dig down a little bit further. So I don't think I'm going to have us look at the word "n" here in each of these, but it is interesting that you see a different connotation in each of these passages in Matthew for the preposition "n." And I use prepositions because they do have a wide range of meaning as an example. So I've forgotten for several weeks, but if you want these slides, let me know, and then you can look up those verses on your own, see how the word is used differently there. Just by quick way of review of prepositions, "n" could be a location, or it could be a means, or it could be a logical concept of where something is. So you got a wide range of meaning with that word "n," and you're not always going to translate it with the English word "in." You may use by, by, to express that preposition. So how should we study Greek words to translate accurately the intent of the author? Here are our basic steps. And then again, we're going to try to get to phrase as the basic meaning. But for starting out, if we want to do a word study, first we need to pick a word. So we need to be reading in our Bible, maybe I would suggest even in our English Bible. And we come to a word and we're like, this seems significant. I'm trying to figure out what this means. So I choose a word that I think is significant in the passage. Though the word, what's that mean? And though that can be significant, it's probably not as significant a word most of the time in most passages. So, but if you come to a word like Christ, that might be more significant. We might want to figure out what does that mean in this context. And so we'll go through. So what we're doing is we are automatically going to, as we come to the selection process, going to try to figure out, even from our own intuition in the whole context, what might be a significant word. How might you decide what is a significant word in ways other than what I've just described?
What is frequency?
Frequencies.
Very often in a book or a passage that is probably the purpose behind that.
All right, so repetition. High frequency could mean that it is significant in a passage. However, on the other side, if it is only used once in the New Testament, that might also be significant. Why was that particular word used? So frequency is a good idea. Any other ways that you pick out a significant word?
It appears to be interchangeable with synonyms
Mm-hmm.
or variations of the title.
Very good.
That might be multiple studies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you're looking for synonyms, parallels, especially if you're doing a Hebrew study, you're looking for parallelism, and you might see some interesting connections between different words. So good. Any other thoughts there?
Well, it's translated in different English translations with different words.
Yes, good. Comparing translations, and if you see differences, in how words are translated. That might mean that it's either a difficult word, or it might mean that you're looking at a translation that has some kind of bias and you're trying to figure out what lies underneath it to figure it out. All right, so then step number 2 is you find out what Greek word lies behind that English word or words. Why would I say word or words?
Sometimes we translate a single Greek word with multiple English words, and even vice versa.
Exactly. So vice versa, there that it could be 1 for 1, could be 1 for 2, or 2 for 1, or and any number beyond that. I've not actually done the Greek trivia to figure out what is the biggest disparity between the number of words in Greek and the number of words in English. And then sometimes you'll pull out your interlinear and just realize it's not even, the English word is not even in the Greek text. A lot of your translations will put it in italics if it's been completely added to give the sense of the phrase. But for instance, ESV, NIV, those have completely done away with italicizing words that are not technically in the Greek text. And I understand the ESV's logic is what they're saying is, we are promising you that we are going to try to give you the best translation of the sense of the whole phrase. And so we think it is in the Greek, and so we're not, even if the exact word is not there, so that's why we're dropping italics. So you can think through the philosophy of translation on your own, but that's why they do it. So you're going to be looking for, is the word there, what lies underneath it, so on and so forth. Step number 3, discover the semantic range. So we're going to look at the phrase and try to figure out, can we figure out what the meaning of this word is just by intuition? But sometimes we're going to have to dig in, click that word, and figure out what is the range of meaning for this word? What could it mean in various contexts? And then figure out how it fits into that context. That's step 4. Examine the context and then translate. Now we're going to go through and do this as an example with Romans chapter 10 and verse 9 in just a moment. But does anybody have any comments or questions about the overarching kind of idea process of going through and studying a word? All right, then let's go to step number 1. So we look for an English word, and we basically already talked about the ways to discover if something is an important word, a theologically loaded word. Look for repetition, look for foreign words. That's one that we didn't mention. Why would Paul use the word Abba when he's writing in Greek everywhere else? Well, it might be significant that he throws in an Aramaic word to represent something. Just for kind of to plant a seed in your mind, there is a good article out there. It's probably more academic. Maybe someone has kind of taken away the academic jargon. But there's a good article out there that was written, I think, in the 80s or 90s that said, Abba does not mean daddy. And I think it's a very significant article. But regardless, look for foreign words. Pay attention to verbs. If you're going to be studying a verb, there's more steps involved. You're going to have to look at the tense, the aspect. If it's a participle, you're going to look at, does it have an article? Does it not have an article? Is it active, middle, or passive? You're going to have to consider all those things as you're looking at verbs. And then, as Tony pointed out, compare translations. I think learning Greek is not so that you can completely abandon translations. It's so that you can intelligently analyze various translations. And so comparing translations is a good method of figuring out how different scholars are dealing with these Greek words, or if you go back to Hebrew words. All right, so let's look at an example in Romans chapter 10 and verse 9. Can someone either quote or read that for us?
Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your hearts that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
All right. So as we read this text, we ask pertinent questions. And this is really kind of a Bible study hermeneutics type thing. Always ask who, what, where, when, why, wherefore. Your big words there. Wherefore is, of course, let me grab my pointer here. Wherefore is kind of old English, but it does make for a nice little flow of the words. And basically it's the so what word. But ask those questions of every text you come to, every phrase you come to in the Bible. Who? Who's going to probably point you to the subject? So it's probably going to point you to a nominative. What? You may be looking at not only what this word means, but maybe what is the object of a verb, so on and so forth. Where? That might point you to a prepositional phrase. It might point you to a participle that gives you circumstances. Same with the word when and why. Why might point you to some of those ina words, like in order that something might happen, or an infinitive, so that something might, to do something. So seeing those questions and now having some of that terminology in your mind from Greek, notice you're asking the same questions that you would in English, but now you can start thinking of it from more of a Greek perspective. You know a little bit more what to look for, and wherefore is maybe the result, the so what, or even stepping beyond just what the text says to what is the application for you and for me. All right? So I want to pick out a significant word, that if you confess Christ as Lord, what does that mean? And there's a lot of debate. That might be another thing that you're looking for, is there debate about how people are interpreting this word that would drive you to study it in the original language? Now, as far as I can tell, every English translation renders the Greek word Lord. So there's great consistency through the English translations. They're translating this word Lord. But let's see if this is significant. And here's the thing. You might go through and do a word study and then determine, I didn't find anything significant here. And that's not a problem. You're not wasting your time whenever you dig into God's word. For instance, I was thinking through some things on Paul's use of the word flesh in his literature. And then I started looking at how he uses prepositions with that word flesh. And I noticed that you have katasarka, which is according to the flesh. You've also got in sarki, which is in the flesh. And I went through and I was studying all those prepositional uses, and I came to determine there's not a lot there that I found particularly significant for what I was looking into with in sarki, but I had done a bunch of research on it. But it did drive me to say, I do need to spend some more time on katasarka with according to the flesh. And so even digging in, even if you think, I just wasted an hour looking up all the different uses, you didn't waste an hour. You are still looking at what God has said in his word, the words that he's used, and it will probably drive you to do a more significant study in the future. So never think that it is insignificant when you're spending time studying those words. So Lord, let's find out, our step 2, what is the Greek word that lies underneath Lord? And if this is not the Blue Letter Bible, this is Bible Hub, but it says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus, Lord Jesus, so this could be that the Lord is Jesus or Jesus is Lord. For some second or third year grammar, Jesus is probably the subject, that Jesus is Lord. The reason for that is usually proper names become the nominative in a predicate nominative predicate construction. So whatever the proper name is, it's usually going to get first place, and then whatever comes after it or before it in the Greek order is going to be the predicate, what it's telling about that person. So that's why most translations render it that Jesus is Lord. The interlinear makes a choice to say that the Lord is Jesus. That's ambiguous. You could go either way, though I would lean toward that Jesus is Lord. But as you look at this word Lord, and here's where the Blue Letter Bible has a little bit of a superior construction to the Bible Hub, is that Bible Hub will give you the English spelling of the form that is here, but this is an accusative form. If you were to click that number, you would then discover that is Kyrios is the lexical form, is the dictionary form, and it probably shows that on Blue Letter Bible, that you have the original form of Kyrios there. So, Kyrios, what does that mean? Well, we have to figure out what Kyrios can mean. Now, here is the dangerous spot. Here's where most people make a big mistake with word studies. They go through and they look at their Strong's Bible Dictionary, and it lists every possible translation of the word Kyrios. And then the person doing their Bible study says, well, I think it sounds kind of neat not to say Lord. I think it sounds kind of neat to say Master. Well, that very well could be. But you could also be missing something else that is there. So we have to look at the range of meaning. And I'm going to show what that looks like in just a moment. But you determine the possible meaning. And here's where you may want to be taking notes, because you go through Thayer, and we've already seen that Thayer could have pages of stuff, and that might not be super helpful. I think the Blue Letter Bible does a decent job at the beginning of outlining the major possible meanings, probably borrowing from various lexicons to give you those major possible meanings. But you may have to do a little reading and figure out, does it only mean this in this kind of context? So you may be relying a little bit on some of those scholars to say, well, it only means this if it's this scenario, especially with verbs. They'll say, well, it only means this if it's in the perfect tense or something along those lines. So you got to be on the eye, look out for that. But take notes. You come to Kyrios, you write Kyrios at the top of your paper. And then you start going through, you write out, well, it could mean this, it could mean this, it could mean this, it could mean this. You're looking for all those possible meanings. In an age of technology, you could also copy and paste the major ideas to a Word document if you so choose. But I would say the easiest way to discover semantic meaning is, one, use Blue Letter Bible or use some of those others. Here is where Strong's could help you, but it doesn't give enough information. It usually gives you every possible translation of the Greek word, though it is dated. Thayer does the same thing, but he usually gives you a lot of jargon in between. BDAG is one I have in my library. It is the best Greek lexicon for the New Testament on the market, but it also has a lot of the jargon. Though it's a lot easier to comprehend than Thayer is because of how it's written. But it's also a $150 book, and so you may not want to spend that much money on a lexicon. Some cheaper versions that are more accessible to all of us is Vine, and basically the new version of Vines is Mounce. Mounce has a book called Mounce's Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament Words. He's going to have some Calvinism, some denominational thought in some of his definitions that you'll have to weed through. For instance, if you come to the word justification, you're probably going to get some Calvinistic ideas there, but you may well get that in any other lexicon as well. So you have to weed through some of that. But he is a very good Greek student, and so that one's probably $30. That one's probably at CEI as well, Mounce's Expository Dictionary. The better but more time-consuming way is to examine every use of the Greek word in the New Testament. So, if you are going to look up every time the word Kyrios is used, can you think of how many times you've seen the word Lord in your New Testament? 500. It's a lot. It's a lot. And what is interesting, though, is that if you were to trace through, and here's two ways of doing this. You can either trace through with your Greek, and that's probably the better, just to figure out specifically for that word, is by using Blue Letter Bible or some other one, clicking that word and going through all the occurrences that pop up. If you want to figure out possible different words, you could search in an English Bible the word Lord, and you'll find that Kyrios is the predominant word that's translated Lord, but you might also have a translation that translates despotes as Lord. It's where we get our word despot, and that's used in the New Testament as well. And so you have some different words that could be translated by the same English word. But best way for our purposes is, if you want to figure out what that word means in its context, is you search it all the way through the New Testament. And then if you're really excited about that word, you can also see me sometime, and we can find a Bible program that will then let you search in Josephus, and that will then let you search in the Church Fathers, and that will let you search in the Jewish pseudepigrapha and apocrypha. you could go crazy looking at how that word was used in the first century, and sometimes that does give you some interesting information, but it is also very time consuming and may not give you any good information. So you have at your fingertips for free every occurrence in the New Testament, and that's probably good enough for now. All right. I forgot also you can search through how the Septuagint uses that word of the Hebrew Bible. Blue Letter Bible is probably your best for searching every occurrence of a word in the New Testament. Bible Hub often truncates, and it just cuts it off after so many occurrences, and so that's not as helpful. Mounts' website, he will let you search every occurrence in the New Testament, but you have to get the Strong's number, then you have to type it into his website, and then he'll bring up every occurrence. But I will say, while I'm bringing up Mounts' website, that he is a good resource for a good, simple dictionary of every possible translation of that word, like as a lexicon, as a dictionary, not just as a concordance to give you every occurrence. All right, so continuing on with range, here we have our passage up here again. We have Lord. Comparing English translations is helpful, but not in this text, because they all say Lord. Commentaries can provide helpful information about the meaning of a word in its specific context. But you have to be careful with commentaries, of course, because that's just someone else doing the very work that you're trying to do. But sometimes they have some sources that you may not have, and so it provides some helpful information. But commentaries is always last on my list. You go through and do it yourself, then go and compare to others. So let's look at how we might do this with Romans 10:9. Yes, sir.
How much emphasis do you put in your word studies on non-biblical usages of Greek words?
I usually do it for myself, just to kind of see how it's used in the first century. I often go to Philo and Josephus because they give you the range of how Jews at that time probably would have used it. Philo was a very Hellenistic Jew. He's trying to conform the Hebrew text to Greek philosophy, and so it's kind of an interesting perspective. Josephus was a Pharisee, but he's also very Hellenistic, and of course kind of turned himself over to the Romans and is very pro-Roman in many ways. But it gives you kind of a form of the Pharisaical view of how that Greek word would have been used, and then a form of Hellenistic kind of Jewish thought. But often that doesn't come into how I would present that in a class, but it does give me a little bit more information of how they might have been using it. I think, for instance, if you study the word faith, I think it is very important to step outside into Roman usage of that. I think Stephen has done a series on faith and how pistis would have been used. That was before I came. But he's appealing to the first century usage because now, if you look up a Bible dictionary, they are only thinking most of the time from a Reformation perspective. And so if you want to go all the way back to how they were using it in the first century, sometimes you have to broaden out. It just depends on the word, really. For instance, on katasarka, according to the flesh, I found that that's a very Pauline expression. But in the Septuagint, it's rarely used. In Josephus, it's rarely used. I looked at some other sources, Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha. It's fairly rarely used, but when it is used, it does kind of match up. So usually it's just a check on what you're doing in the New Testament. Are there others who are using it the same way that it seems like Paul is using it? Or is Paul completely changing how it would have been thought of? So those are just things to think about. That's where I see the benefit of going outside the New Testament, is just to see, does this conform or does this transform the usage in the first century? Any additional thoughts? All right, so let's look at Kyrios here. Was anybody ever in choir? Did you ever see Do you ever the Kyrie? It's a very Catholic idea.
Choir, but Mr. I'm Kyrie later.
Gotcha. So,
Hebrew 3 Orthodox.
gotcha. So this is the vocative form, "O Lord," and so that Kyrios kind of carries over. A lot of Catholic songs, Latin borrows the same idea of speaking to the Lord, and so you have a Kyrie. In fact, I think part of Josh could probably help me on my music history here, but I think certain Catholic songs would have had sections and one being a Kyrie or something along those lines. So that word carries over into Christian usage later on, and it's specifically applied to Jesus. But here we see Paul taking this word and applying it to Jesus. Now what we have to do is step back into the first century. Jesus had been around for the first part of the first century. When Paul is writing, he's probably been dead and resurrected for 20, 25 years. And now Paul is taking this and he's using this word Lord of Jesus. Now, what would that have meant for an audience who was not used to, this was new for Jesus to be referred to as Lord? Well, we're going to try to figure out what does he mean when he calls Jesus Lord. And I have occurrences throughout here and just giving you representatives, because what you could do is you could say, sometimes it's translated sir, because it's someone who comes to Jesus and doesn't even believe in his deity yet, and yet they call him Lord. They're probably not falling on their knees worshiping him, at least some of these examples. They're not falling on their knees and worshiping him. And so this would have been used of anyone, just like we would say, sir. I doubt any of us here are knighted, and yet we will sometimes refer to each other as sir. And so we're taking and using it in a slightly different, a lesser way than it would have been used in ancient English or Old English. And so we have sir could be a translation of Kyrios. So is Paul just saying that when you call Jesus sir, that's going to lead to your salvation? Well, probably not. We're keeping it in a context in Romans chapter 10 of this is not just some random person coming up and giving a respectful greeting to someone. This is Paul saying this is the essence of Christian salvation, is that you call Jesus Lord. So we can probably strike that one out, but that is one possible usage. The next could just be a master. Jesus uses this of you have slaves and you have masters, and he uses the word Kyrie for the plural form. And so you have a master. Now, was a slave supposed to fall on his face and worship their master as God? No, that's just a word to describe the relationship, that you have a master and you have a slave. So is Paul just saying that if you confess Jesus as your master, that's a possible meaning. In fact, it may be part of the meaning, is that you have to make sure that you are saying Jesus is your master. But is that all that Paul is saying, or is that even primarily what Paul is saying? So what I would probably do if I was studying through, and I find this usage in Matthew 10:24, that it could just be a master, I have to say that is possible. He may be saying that if you confess that Jesus is your master, that you've changed to a master-slave relationship, and the reason I could say that is contextually possible is because how does Paul describe the Christian relationship in Romans chapter 6? You are slaves of righteousness. And so we've already got that slave-master idea, so it is contextually possible. We have in 1 Corinthians 8:5 that it could be a Lord that is a God. And he even talks about there are many lords and many gods, so-called. Actually, I don't think the word so-called is there. It may be inserted. I have to look in the text. But he is obviously not saying that there really are many actual real gods out there. He's saying that, and most translations will then say that there are so-called gods out there because there are a lot of idols that are worshipped. There's a lot of paganism in the world. And so Lord could be that you have G with a lowercase. Our Jehovah's Witness friends probably would lean on that, is that it could just be that it's talking about God with a lowercase g. So we have to consider, is that possible. Now, we're going to have to consider context beyond it, but what we're already seeing is it's probably not just sir, but it could be master, could be lowercase g God, though we already know that that doesn't fit with the whole context of the New Testament, that you would have a lowercase g God besides the Father, besides the God of the Bible. Or it could be Lord in all uppercase. Now, the reason I say Lord in all uppercase is because most translations of the Old Testament, what does that translate? Yahweh. Or, I like to write it, Yahweh. And what that could be saying is, Jesus is Yahweh. Do you confess Jesus as Yahweh? We have to see if that is a possible meaning. Because what's interesting is if you look in Matthew 22:44, and you don't have to look because it'd have to be a Greek text before you, but you have this comparison to Psalm 110 and verse 1, where Jesus says, whose son is the Messiah in essence? And they say, David's. And he says, well, then how did David say in the Spirit, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Now it says, the Lord, in the Hebrew, the Lord said to my Lord. Does anyone know what that might be in Hebrew with L with lowercase? Adonai. That's what it says in Hebrew. Yahweh said to my Adonai. But in Greek, Kyrios, said to my Kyrios. Actually, that'd probably be Kyrian, or Kyria, or Kyrio, sorry. So it's a dative. Omega, to my Lord. So you have some play on that. Lord translates Yahweh. Lord translates Adonai. But it's really not Matthew's usage. I went through and kept most of them in Matthew if I could to show that Kyrios can be translating sir. It can be translating master. It can be translating a lowercase g God, or it can be translating uppercase g God, or Lord, Yahweh. Because in the first occurrence, Lord is translating Yahweh, even if it isn't necessarily in the second, is translating a different word. But here is your range of meaning. You've got 4 possible meanings of Lord. You've got to figure out what does it mean in Romans chapter 10 and verse number 9. And here's the thing. This is a text where you could be a devout Orthodox Christian and come to a different conclusion about whether he's just saying Jesus is your master or whether he is specifically saying Jesus is Yahweh. I think we wouldn't have to fall out with one another for someone to say, you must confess Jesus as your master, versus someone saying, you must confess Jesus as God. And I will tell you what I lean toward at some point, but though we're about out of time, let me put the next screen up here. Step number 4, context is now going to determine. You've got the range of meaning. You've got possible meanings, and I'm already throwing out the first and the third one because that doesn't fit with what I already know about the New Testament, that Jesus is not just a respectful human being, a sir, neither is he a lowercase g God. So it has to be that he's talking either about him being a master or him being Lord, Yahweh. And so I look for the contextual meaning. What in the context is going to express it? Now, context is not just the verse before and after, though that is a context. Sometimes it's been described as you have to look at the verse before and you have to look at the verse after. Sometimes that answers questions very quickly. But context is, what is the whole unit of thought? So paragraph. What's then multiple paragraphs? How do those fit together? What's the whole book tell you? Then what's the whole New Testament tell you? then what's the whole Old and New Testament tell you? And then you're working your way out. And sometimes you even have to go to what is the first century culture tell you? And so you're moving out step by step. And we'll talk some more about that in the next class. But I want you to start thinking about Romans 10, 9, and see if you have some things in mind of what that might mean. You've gotten the range of meaning. Let's figure out some context. I'm going to present several ideas as to why I lean toward number 4. So I'm showing my hand here. I think it's number 4, and I'll show you why. But you come with your own thoughts as well. Like I said, I'm not going to fall out with you if you decide number 2 is correct. All right, thank you.